Hi everyone, welcome back to another video, and today I have yet another episode of the Redrawing Classical Paintings in My Style series. And this is a pretty big one, and I have been avoiding doing this one for a while because it's such an iconic painting and artist. And of course we're doing the Mona Lisa by Leonardo da Vinci. Again, I've been avoiding doing this one because he's like probably one of the most famous painters in the world. There's a lot to be said about this. Like I did a whole day and a half of research of this, and it took me a while, but I'm really proud of the research that I got for you guys on the art history lesson portion of this video. And this painting was also voted by my patrons. I always put up a poll on my Patreon asking my patrons to vote on which painting I should do next on the series, so they voted for this one. If you guys want to be a part of the voting poll for next time, make sure to check out my Patreon here. The polls are open to all tiers. Yeah, so I'm going to be redrawing the Mona Lisa, the iconic Mona Lisa, in my style digitally as I usually do on this series, and giving you guys a little bit of an art history lesson about Leonardo da Vinci himself and the Mona Lisa. So without any further ado, let's get into today's video. So as I said, today I will be redrawing the iconic Mona Lisa by Leonardo da Vinci, and I will also be giving you a little art history lesson on Leonardo da Vinci and his life and works, including this painting. He's quite possibly the most famous painter in the world, so we got a lot to get through. So let's get started. So first off, as you can see, I was using the original Mona Lisa as reference, as I always do on this series, and trying to get the basic rough sketch of the portrait down. And for some reason, I had a lot of trouble with the proportions on this. I usually am very good with portraiture, but for some reason in this case, her head was massive for 3 attempts, and I kept having to shrink the head down in comparison to the body. It was just, the proportions were just not giving for this one. I was just having a bad drawing day, but in the end I managed to get to a sketch that I was happy with, and the proportions seemed to be correct, question mark. It was also very hard to get a lot of the details in the painting because obviously it's quite an old painting. A lot of the darker areas are so blended with each other, and they are kind of also photographed. They don't photograph that well because they were already quite old when photographed. So it was kind of hard to figure out what was actually happening in a lot of these darker areas. So I kind of had to use a bit of my imagination, especially in the background. And it wasn't an attempt at me not to do a background. I actually was confused as to what was happening, and I ended up doing a pretty good job with the background, if I do say so myself. So now that I'm just getting into the line art here because I was happy with the sketch, let's get into the life and work of Leonardo da Vinci. I'll be giving you a distilled version of his biography, of course, just for the sake of this video not being hours long. So if you'd like to read up more on him or on the Mona Lisa in specific, I will leave the links to all of my sources down in the description box. And with all that said, let's go. Leonardo di Ser Piero da Vinci was born on April the 15th, 1452, in a Tuscan hamlet in the region of Florence, near Vinci, thus the name meaning from Vinci. Da Vinci was a polymath, meaning he was a man of many hats. During his lifetime of 67 years, he was a scientist, a mathematician, engineer, inventor, anatomist, painter, sculptor, architect, botanist, musician, and writer. And honestly, no one's CV will ever top this one because the man was just purely insane. If you can't say all of your past jobs in one breath, then you're on the same level as Da Vinci. Congratulations. Da Vinci lived and worked during the golden age of art and creativity, alongside names like Raphael and Michelangelo, and left his golden touch not only in the world of art, but science as well. Born as the illegitimate son of Piero da Vinci, a Florentine notary and landlord, and a peasant girl named Caterina. And although an illegitimate child, Leonardo still, quote, grew up on his father's family estate, where he was treated as a legitimate son and received the usual elementary education of that day, so reading, writing, and arithmetic, end quote. At the age of 14, Da Vinci started a 9-year apprenticeship in Florence with Andrea del Verrocchio, who was a very popular sculptor, painter, and goldsmith at the time. At this apprenticeship, Leonardo likely met great legends such as Sandro Botticelli, whom we've done a video about already on the channel, and worked alongside other apprentices like Domenico Ghirlandaio, Pietro Perugino, and Lorenzo di Credi. Whew. Can you imagine being 14 years old and getting to learn directly from and working with some of the most famous people in your field? It must have been incredible. One can only imagine what it was like inside that studio. Verrocchio, who originally worked under Donatello back in the day and was the official sculptor of the Medici family, taught Leonardo art, sculpture, and also technical mechanical arts. And just as a quick note about the Medici family, for those of you who may not know, the Medici family were the family that ruled Italy and more specifically Florence during that time. I actually got to visit the Medici palaces when I went to Florence a few years back, and it was the most extensive collection of art I've ever experienced. I'd say it was even more incredible than the Uffizi Gallery itself. So think kind of like the Kardashians, but in old-timey Florence. During this time, Da Vinci also worked next door at another artist's workshop, Antonio Pollaiuolo. I'm gonna go with that. In 1472, at the age of 20, Leonardo was accepted into the Painters Guild of Florence, but he stayed in Verrocchio's workshop for another 5 years. Upon leaving Verrocchio's studio in 1481, he worked independently in Florence, during which time he created some incredible extant pen and pencil drawings, including many, quote, technical sketches. For example, pumps, military weapons, mechanical apparatus, end quote, which showed his interest and love for mechanical and technical subjects right off the bat. After receiving 2 very big commissions in Florence, the unfinished panel painting Adorations of the Magi for the monastery of San Donato a Scopeto, and also an altar painting for the St. Bernard Chapel, Leonardo actually instead moved away from Florence to Milan in 1482 to work in service of the Milanese Duke. Some people speculate that there would have been a deeper, more personal reason for him moving out of Florence and not ever even starting either one of these big commissions before up and leaving to Milan. Some think that he felt frustrated and stifled in Florence and thought that Milan would have more exciting opportunities to offer. This is when he painted the first version of the Virgin of the Rocks, who the original client actually didn't want to pay the full price for, so Leonardo sold it out to someone else. And, you know, a story as old as time, people not wanting to pay artists for their work. A few years later, he was actually asked to paint it again, commissioned by the same people, and it is this version that now hangs in the National Gallery. During this time of change, Leonardo focused on religious subjects and took portrait commissions whenever they popped up. Over the next 5 years, he created many notable paintings such as the Madonna of the Carnation, Ginevra de' Benci, Benoit Madonna, and the unfinished St. Jerome in the Wilderness. Leonardo also kept many notebooks of his ongoing research into science, biology, anatomy, engineering, and art. They were filled with drawings, diagrams, and the infamous mirrored handwriting notes. Da Vinci spent a total of 17 years in Milan, where he completed the legendary wall painting The Last Supper, that took him 3 years to complete. Some say that due to his thirst to improve and to fine-tune his technique, it is the reason that this painting deteriorated so quickly. Leonardo used oil-based paint on plaster for this monumental piece of Jesus and his disciples because his usual water-based fresco paints were difficult to blend for the sfumato effect that he wanted to achieve. And just a side note, sfumato is a technique that involves light shading, creating a soft, blended render, for anyone who might not know. Quote, within only a few decades, much of the painting had flaked away from the wall in its location at the Santa Maria del Grazie convent. The canvas of Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper that now hangs in the Louvre is in large part a reproduction of the failed fresco, end quote, says leonardodavinci.net. In this painting, we can also see the outcome of Leonardo's belief that poses, gestures, and facial expressions should reflect the, quote, motions of the mind. During his time in Milan, he was also regularly consulted as an architect for fortifications and military matters, as well as working as a hydraulics and mechanical engineer, all whilst working as a painter and sculptor for the Duke of Milan. In 1499, the French army invaded Milan, and Da Vinci returned to Florence, where he continued his practices into the human face and how it could depict the emotions and motions of the soul through expressions and gestures. Here is where this painting, the Mona Lisa, comes in. She's famous for her enigmatic expression, but more on her in a bit. Becoming bored of Florence quickly, Da Vinci quickly moved back to Milan in 1508 to work for the French rulers who had now taken over the city. He stayed there working on different compositions and reiterations of many finished paintings that are now hanging in the Louvre for 5 years, before moving to Rome for 3 years. Some might say that he was actually the originator of the thumbnailing concept and planning out paintings on paper before getting to the real thing. At one point, he was offered the title of the first painter and engineer of the king by the French King François I, and moved into the Château of Cloux in 1517, and this is actually where he spent the rest of his life. Can you imagine getting just offered a chateau by the king? This guy was really, he had connects. Leonardo's love for science flourished during his second period in Milan. Quote, his studies in anatomy achieved a new dimension in his collaboration with Marcantonio della Torre, a famous anatomist from Pavia, end quote, as said by the Britannica. He had outlined a plan for a project that would include exact, detailed reproductions of the human body and its organs, but also would have, quote, comparative anatomy and the whole field of physiology, end quote. The man was nothing if not ambitious, after all. His investigations into the mechanics of the human body were driven by one central ideology that we've already touched upon, that the force and motion as basic mechanical functions produce all outward forms in organic and inorganic nature, giving them their shape. So basically, calling back to his beliefs that one can always depict the human soul and mind through the outside shapes of the physical body. In the later years of his life, Leonardo was struck with illness, and a stroke left him paralyzed down the right side of his body. This did not stop him, however, from continuing his research and studies in his notebooks, the same notebooks we mentioned earlier. It's thought, though, that his assistants and pupils, Melzi and Salai, did most of the physical work. His ever-growing obsession with his experiments and scientific projects are what caused him to become known for not finishing any of his artistic endeavors. He became more focused on his science and left so many works unfinished in his lifetime that it actually became a very torturous task in later centuries to find actual real Leonardos amongst so many copies and false sketches being thrown around. In 1519, Leonardo died, succumbing to old age and illnesses, leaving most of his works to his adored pupil and companion Francesco Melzi. He was buried in Amboise in the palace church of Saint Florentin, near the residence where he spent the last years of his life. Looking at the works amongst his peers, his influence was nothing to sneeze at. Raphael, and actually even his longtime rival Michelangelo, adopted a lot of Da Vinci's signature techniques to produce their own works with anatomically realistic figures. Leonardo only actually completed 17 paintings in his lifetime, as he was chronically unable to finish his works. To this day, art enthusiasts around the world consider his painting, the Mona Lisa, to be the greatest painting of all time. Quote, her image continues to appear on items ranging from t-shirts to refrigerator magnets, and rather than trivializing the import of the masterpiece, this popularity serves to immortalize Leonardo da Vinci's paintings and drawings. They still remain at the forefront of people's hearts and minds centuries after his death, says leonardodavinci.net. And on that note, let's get into the actual painting that I am redrawing here, the Mona Lisa. So, the Mona Lisa, also known as Portrait of Lisa Gherardini or La Gioconda, is the wife of Francesco de Giocondo, mostly believed, but more on that later. It is an oil painting on a poplar wood panel painted by, of course, Leonardo da Vinci, sometime between 1503 and 1519, during his time in Florence. The painting is 77 by 53 centimeters big and is officially owned by the government of France. It now hangs in the Louvre Museum in Paris, which I've actually gone to see a few times in my life. The most recent time was last year, and you might have actually seen it in the studio vlog of that time. And I think a lot of people have this reaction. They get quite surprised at how tiny it is. I think people think that the Mona Lisa is this really big painting, but it's actually really, really tiny. I'd say around like an A2 piece of paper. It depicts the figure of a woman, quote, dressed in Florentine fashion of her day and seated in a visionary mountainous landscape, end quote, wearing an enigmatic smile. She is sat at a three-quarter view, in which only her head is pointing in the viewer's direction. This type of pose was a big departure from the standard profile pose used a lot in Italian art at the time, and as the trendsetter Leonardo was, it quickly became the norm for all portraits, even up to the 21st century. Her identity being unproven, and her, quote, alluring and aloof expression, both made the painting an everlasting source of fascination and intrigue. The painting is a great example of Leonardo's sfumato technique of, quote, soft, heavily shaded modeling, end quote, said by the LeonardoDaVinci.net. They also go on to say, quote, it is a visual representation of the idea of happiness suggested by the word Gioconda in Italian. Leonardo made this notion of happiness the central motif of the portrait, end quote. While I don't exactly agree with these very deep meanings that people seem to find in the painting, I do agree that the expression and the feeling played a great part in the painting. As if you'll remember, this painting was done during a time when Leonardo was obsessed with the exploration of the notion that you could depict the soul and the emotions of someone through gesture and facial expression. But honestly, it seems like this was more of a practice piece to train his sfumato technique and human anatomy. The background is quite interesting too. It's a purely imagined landscape for starters, with the middle distance around her chest being painted in warm colors and urbanized features such as a bridge and a winding road. Quote, this space represents the transition between the space of the sitter and the far distance, where the landscape becomes a wild and uninhabited space of rocks and water, which stretches to the horizon, which Leonardo has cleverly drawn at the level of the sitter's eyes, says LeonardoDaVinci.net. It is also one of the first ever paintings to depict aerial perspective. Quote, the blurred lines, graceful figure, dramatic contrast of light and dark, and overall feeling of calm are characteristic of Da Vinci's style, end quote. On MonaLisa.org, you'll also find, interestingly enough, there are actually 2 Mona Lisas in existence. He actually painted 2 Mona Lisas. You can find a lot more about this on MonaLisa.org, but following extensive research, the Mona Lisa Foundation's mission is now to make Leonardo's, quote, earlier Mona Lisa known and loved in its own right, as much as the version that hangs in the Louvre Museum. The foundation tells the remarkable story of this 500-year-old masterpiece, mobilizes art historians, scientists, forensic artists, and other experts to prove the earlier Mona Lisa's authenticity and Leonardo's exceptional skills. There's a book about it that you can read if you want. Personally, because it hasn't been authenticated, I didn't put much about this second Mona Lisa into this video, but of course you can have a look on the link in the description for the 2 Mona Lisas side by side. Leonardo's technique and years of practice are evident as ever in the Mona Lisa, from the excellent understanding of the anatomy and musculature of the skull, to the delicacy of the painted veil, to even the tiny little rendered details of her garments and the textile folds. In regards to the identification of the subject, again, there's been a lot of speculation regarding this topic. Very much a mystery still. As we said earlier, she is most popularly believed to be Lisa del Giocondo, the wife of merchant Francesco di Bartolomeo del Giocondo, thus the alternative title given to the painting, La Gioconda. Another theory is that the subject is actually Leonardo's peasant mother, Caterina. And this theory, amongst others, was perpetrated mostly by, you guessed it, your mom's friend and mine, Sigmund Freud. Our boy. Of course he would say this. The last theory is that the subject is meant to represent Leonardo himself as a sort of self-portrait. Some say that this is because the sitter and Leonardo share a lot of similar facial features, and that, quote, disguising himself as a woman was the artist's riddle, end quote, says the Britannica. Not so sure I believe that last one, but yeah, I'm gonna go with Lisa del Giocondo as well. There were actually even numerous attempts to find Lisa del Giocondo's remains in order to either test her DNA or make facial reconstructions to see if they'd match, but to no avail. And speaking of crazy things, did you know that Mona Lisa was stolen? Yes, it was missing for 2 years, back in 1911. As described by the Louvre as the theft of the century, quote, on the 21st of August 1911, panic broke out at the Louvre. The Mona Lisa had disappeared. The news spread like wildfire and generous rewards were promised for her return, but all in vain. Nothing was heard of the painting for over 2 years. Then, one day, Vincenzo Perugia, a glazier who had worked at the Louvre, tried to sell the world's most famous painting to an Italian art dealer, who alerted the authorities. So, the Mona Lisa was recovered, and her fame was all the greater." End quote. Kind of a crazy story, right? An ex-worker of the Louvre tried to sell the world's most famous painting. It is very crazy, and also big ups to that Italian art dealer who alerted the authorities. What a slay. She still sits at the Louvre to this day in her own little room, and weirdly enough, she even has her own mailbox where she receives regular love letters and flowers from admirers from around the world. So yes, in case you were wondering, you too can write the Mona Lisa a letter, but I can't promise you who will actually read it, so don't put any weird personal details in there, okay? And that is pretty much it for the Mona Lisa and Leonardo da Vinci. Again, all of my sources are down there in the description if you guys want to read a little bit more about this. There's a lot to be said, both about this painting in particular and Leonardo's legacy that he left to the world of art. Lots to see and lots to read. And now getting back to my silly little digital redraw of this very important painting. So, as per usual, I just kind of did my own reiteration of this painting using my own style and the way that I render things. So I color picked, as I usually do on this series, from the original painting so that I could get the exact tones used. Obviously, I saturated and lightened up a bunch of the colors just to get them a little bit more true to life, or what I assume they would have looked more at the time. Just because paintings from that time age a lot because they were made of like egg yolk or something. It was crazy. So obviously they just deteriorated a lot and they get really dark. So I always, when I do these redraws, I try to, brighten them up a bit so that it's a bit more readable. And it's also cool to see what the colors could have possibly looked like closer to the time that they were painted. As my niche is, and I love this series so much because of this, I got a lot of fabric folds to draw. I really love drawing fabric folds, so I just really enjoyed this painting because obviously Da Vinci was a big fan of fabric folds, and he did the most in this department. Obviously, I drew her face and her little smirk and her little smile. Obviously, I didn't do it as iconically as Leonardo did at the time, but I like to think that I did a pretty good enough job. And obviously I rendered her face in my style, or how I draw it. And yeah, I just kind of went to town rendering this painting. I would say that the biggest challenge for me was the background, as usually it is. So there was a lot of elements in the background that I kind of just rushed my way through because, first of all, they were really hard to understand in the original painting because everything was kind of dark and mushy. So I kind of had to use my imagination a lot, and also there was just so much land. It's just kind of boring to render, So I focused a lot more, obviously, on the subject at hand, the Mona Lisa. It was a fairly quick one, so sorry if the playback of the process video is kind of slow, but it was just a portrait, so it was kind of fairly quick to redraw. Only took me a few days, and the voiceover was quite extensive, so I had to work some editing magic here. And yeah, this is pretty much the end of the speed draw. Pretty straightforward, and I was just kind of a fan of how it came out. Again, a lot of greens and a lot of sort of earthy tones, which is colors that I don't get to use that often in my sort of style and my usual drawings. So it's always good to push myself a little bit outside of my comfort zone, even if it is just in the color palette. And yeah, I was very excited to do this one purely because of the portrait fashion of this. I love a good portrait, and it's my niche personally, so when I get to redraw a very iconic portrait, it's very exciting. So yeah, let me know what you thought of my redraw. Let me know what you thought about the history of this painting, Leonardo da Vinci, and if there was something that you didn't know that you learned today, let me know in the description, because I definitely learned a lot of things just doing the research for this video. There's a lot of crazy facts about the Mona Lisa and Leonardo da Vinci himself, so it's an endless pit of knowledge. And yeah, here she is. Let me know what you think of her. I really hope you guys enjoyed this video. I'm really proud of how it came out and all the information that I managed to like compile into the voiceover. I hope you like the redraw as well. I think it ended up looking really cute. And yeah, if you guys are interested in buying a print of this drawing, you can actually buy all of the prints so far on the series on my shop. The Mona Lisa will probably only be up in a few weeks because obviously I have to send it off to print. But yeah, all the prints in the series have like gold foil on them as well, so they look really regal and pretty. So yeah, make sure to check out the link to my shop and have a look at the prints on there. And also you can check out my Patreon and everything else that I do in the description. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed today's video, and I'll see you guys in my next video. Bye bye!